Recording. Action.
I don't see you.
Stop talking. You're on the video. Don't talk.
Oh, I'm gonna talk so fast.
Hi. We're gonna pick up here with a whole bunch of ferret genes. We left off yesterday. Dylan.
He said like 10 minutes ago, I knew I see you. I see you.
We left off yesterday. Right here, we have just kind of talked about basics of. I feel like I should keep looking at this at the camera. That's a weird instinct to have.
Your class. You're gonna edit this out.
No, I'm leaving it in.
Let's keep it candid.
They can fast forward themselves. They don't want this this fun discourse.
Lock in.
Let's talk about ferrets. And the context for ferrets here is, look at all the genes of these ferrets. So again, we're looking at the gene pool of a bunch of ferrets. So we have genotype. Want me to angle
I
it?
thought the D's on them were eyes on
Oh.
the black
I
ones.
used to have
Oh, they don't. Nope. Those are just the letter D, like for a trait, right? They have dominant alleles and recessive alleles. Big D's, little D's. Homozygous dominant, homozygous recessive, heterozygous. All of them. And so the reason we're using this is because we use in Honors Bio 2. We learned about this, and I talked about this a lot. About something called Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. So this is a mechanism, a mathematical model used to help establish whether or not a population is evolving. Here's what you got to know about Hardy-Weinberg. So we're not going to have to do any of the calculations, if you remember that from Honors Bio 2. No calculatings, which is nice. But we need to know the importance of it and what it's talking about. So this is where we're defining Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. It's describing a situation in which a population is not evolving. And if that's the case, then we can run some math on it. That's kind of like the baseline. So if a population is not evolving, then the gene pool doesn't change from one generation to the next. That means the allele frequencies of dominant capital D's versus recessive lowercase d's, that doesn't change over time. Assuming that's the case, this means our population is not evolving. Then we have to have 5 characteristics happening that help define no evolution. It's kind of a weird backwards way of thinking about evolution.
No mutations.
Right.
No.
So in other words, think through in your head what you're doing, which is what are the things that cause evolution, because they cannot be happening here. So mutations lead to change. There's one. So no mutations. What else were you saying?
No sexual reproduction.
Well, there is sexual reproduction, but
No. Fertile.
so we're working toward like maybe mate choice is random. So there's no sexual selection, which is I think the direction you're maybe going. So no mutations is one. There's no particular order to this. There cannot be any natural selection. There cannot be mutations. Again, these are the things that lead to change. So we need to say those can't be happening if our population is not evolving. All right, so no natural selection, no mutations. The population has to be big, which means little random effects don't actually impact the population. So in other words, for 3 where it says the population is large, what I mean there is there's no genetic drift, which we'll come back to and talk about. But genetic drift is a random impact to a population. So if the population is big, genetic drift has no impact. Individuals made at random. There's no mate choice, in other words. If there's mate choice, then like peahens are choosing the peacocks with the biggest tail, or female cardinals are choosing the brightest red male cardinals. And that drives change over time. We call that sexual selection. So if mate choice doesn't exist, if there is none, if just mating is random, then there's no particular direction to it. So we need to have random mating. And then of course we can't have individuals moving around, because we talked about yesterday, one of the ways populations gene pools can change is if you have individuals coming in or out. We call that gene flow in our evolutionary kind of vocab. So no gene flow, aka no migration. So if those 5 cases are in effect, then our population is not evolving, and based on those assumptions, we can crunch some numbers, we can run some math on it. We will not have to do that, so I'll get to advance through a bunch of these Hardy-Weinberg slides that describe the mathematics involved. We do not need to worry about it. Which means I can even proceed past the questions here. Watch this. Get out. Boom. All that gets to go away. So we need to explain Hardy-Weinberg in its 5 characteristics really only for one reason, and that is because those 5 assumptions we make if a population is in Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, those are the 5 mechanisms of evolution. So if we're thinking about what causes change in a population, it's those 5 things, combination of those. So they're a good kind of roadmap to thinking about like what causes evolution. So let's focus on the natural selection thing real quick. The next lab that we do, next Thursday's lab, covers this. So natural selection, there are really 3 kinds of natural selection. Okay? So again, survival of the fittest, but the question then becomes, well, who's the most fit? Which individuals in our population are the most fit ones that get to reproduce most and pass on their favorable traits? So there are 3 models that describe this. We have directional selection, we have stabilizing selection, we have disruptive selection. Those are kind of the 3 kinds of natural selection. So under what circumstances do each of them operate? What about directional selection first? What do you think? Directional selection is when, well, this is a very bad definition because that's what selection is, but directional selection is when we have our initial population, this is our bell curve describing our population. If one end of that bell curve is favored, those individuals are the ones who get to reproduce more, and our bell curve ends up just sliding over in the next generation, or 2, or 3, or 4. And that is what we call directional selection. All right, our bell curve that describes the variation of a population just slides in one direction. And that's what makes it beautiful. That's a one direction joke.
You know they're getting back together and they're having a concert?
How many concerts? 1?
I don't know. I think it's like a tour. I seen it, it's next year.
Is that cool?
Yep.
All right, I like that too then. I like that for you guys. I'm gonna slide this all over this way a little bit, just a touch for you guys. What about disruptive selection? This is every teenager's favorite kind of natural selection because it's disruptive. So again, the way we're framing these kinds of natural selection is who of our bell curve of our population is favored. If it's one edge of it, ends up being directional. If it's both edges of it, both extremes of our variation, if both extremes of our variation are favored, they reproduce more, pass on their favorable traits, you end up with this weird kind of M-shaped double curve. That's called disruptive. So we've disrupted that nice smooth bell curve that describes the variation of a population. That's disruptive. And the third kind here that we're talking about is the only other possibility. So in directional selection, one extreme of our variation is favored. In disruptive, both extremes are favored. And the only other possibility is what if the middle is favored? That's where we get stabilizing selection. The middle of our variation is favored. Those are the ones that are already most common. They are the ones that reproduce the most. They continue to reproduce the most. So our spread out bell curve stabilizes right around that middle point. It becomes much more pointed. Those are the 3 kinds of selection. You guys learn about those in Bio 1. You learn about those in Bio 2. Hopefully you're like, oh yeah, got this. Dylan, your facial expression is disagreeing with me. Huh? Okay, we can move past that. And let's talk about this quick question. As humans migrated out of Africa and towards Northern Europe, reduced exposure to UV selected for lighter skin color. But what type of natural selection does this illustrate? So here's what I want you to picture. I want you to picture a bell curve illustrating human population and skin color. So we have colors ranging from very dark all the way to very pale. That's like the range of skin tones, right? Yeah, so if these ones are the favored ones, right? If those individuals are favored, they'll reproduce more as you move away from being selecting for darker pigment, for more melanin. And so, yeah, so everything just kind of slides over. It's directional selection. Directional. Got it? Good. All right, so what about that whole notion of sexual selection? So this is where, in reality, mate choice is not random, right? Mate choice is not random, it's non-random. And it leads to this weird situation that we call sexual selection. Again, something you guys have heard about. But this is the explanation for why we have such bizarre traits in a bunch of creatures. Classic example are these peacock feathers, right? Why do peacocks have these giant tail feathers?
Female attraction.
Natural selection would favor traits that make you better at surviving, right? At catching food, at avoiding predators, at being camouflaged, etc. This does the exact opposite. This is actually attention grabbing. This is energetic to grow and energetic to maintain. It slows you down.
Shows power, because you can survive with it.
Yeah, so that's where we're going, yeah. So a peahen will choose the peacock with the craziest, biggest, brightest tail because basically, if you're alive and despite this nonsense, you must be really good in other ways, right? That's kind of the argument. It's called the handicap hypothesis to help explain why sexual selection happens. Otherwise, you can't explain like some of the weird behaviors and courtship rituals that we see. Why are cardinals bright red? It doesn't help you avoid predators. It does the opposite. It's because females are selectively choosing to mate with males that are red, right? It's a cue to their quality. So it ends up doing the opposite of helping things survive. But these traits exist because they're the ones still reproducing, so they're the ones passing on those traits. So sexual selection guides evolution in some weird, interesting ways. Okay, that's the description of this. The peacock tail, classic example. I would make sure you make note of that. It's not the only example, but it's the classic. And if you guys want to touch this feather, you can if you want. You guys want to touch this? Here you go. With a feather?
I forgot to take it.
I got criticized for the tape on there, but I says to you guys, no, that'll help it stay.
I seen a video the other day of that one bird. Its mating call, it like bubbles with its chest. The one bird, it like, you know what I'm talking about? We watched it last year.
Yes, so one of probably the sage
I don't know, but
grouse.
he has a-
Yeah, real big
big,
air
like-
inflating air sacs, yeah.
Yeah,
Like
that
that?
one.
Yeah. Yeah, look up the greater sage grouse. You won't regret it.
It's odd to
Yeah.
watch. It's very odd.
Yeah, disconcerting. So, kind of underlying this whole, discussion of sexual selection is this mate choice thing. So really what we're pointing at is the evolution of these interesting traits, whether they're physical or behavioral, their characteristics, right? It's driven by mate choice. And that is almost always females choosing males. But there's also, so that's like the part two of this. The first part of this, huh?
Occurs in when?
Occurs in when the stronger, that makes no sense.
Yeah.
Good sentence. There are two parts to this mate choice, really. The first step is males fighting for access to females. and that's intra-sexual competition. So there's competition built into this. Intra means within. So intra-sexual competition occurs in males when the stronger individuals battle to win access to mates. So it's typically males quite literally bashing their dumb heads against each other. Like that is a normal thing. You see what these guys are doing. All right? The winner of that contest isn't guaranteed reproduction, but has guaranteed access to females. Like, okay, now they've like gotten in the building, right? That's step one, is win the contest against other males so that the females will notice you. And then part two is the intersexual competition. This is the form that we describe as mate choice. Females choosing males. They'll choose the winners of that contest often, but there are other variables involved here, and we're not quite sure what those are all the time, but this is typically intersexual competition. The part of this sexual selection is females choosing males. Okay. Okay, so again, we're kind of moving through those 5 aspects that define Hardy-Weinberg, right? So we've talked now about natural selection, talked about mate choice, so sexual selection, non-random mate choice. There are 3 others to mention, so let's go to this. Mutations. So mutations lead to changes, right? They change in random ways, but they change populations. They change the traits that show up in individuals. Mutations play a huge role because we usually associate the idea of mutation as having a negative connotation, but it's not true. Mutations are just a change. Sometimes they're bad, sometimes they have no impact, sometimes they end up leading to traits that benefit organisms. Sometimes they're good. So how else do you have organisms that are like perfectly camouflaged in an environment? Well, how do they end up looking like their environment? Accidents. And then the accident maybe leads to a trait that makes you a little bit more camouflaged in your habitat, which means you live and you pass on those camouflage traits. Those tiny incremental changes we were talking about yesterday. So mutations can be beneficial. And especially beneficial mutations get passed on in the subsequent generations, right? Because if it's beneficial, it helps you reproduce. Helps you live and reproduce. So those get passed on. So beneficial mutations get passed on. It actually happens a lot. So we know about mutations. So that's 3 of the 5 things. There are 2 more. And they are these. They are genetic drift, which again doesn't have a huge impact if a population is substantially large. If it's huge, you don't worry about this. Genetic drift, the 4th of the 5. So genetic drift is a random change in a population. Just a random change to a population's gene pool. There are a couple major kinds of genetic drift, which we have to be familiar with. Again, this is actually, technically, all of this is just review. But we're refreshing these things, right? So genetic drift does not lead into a particular favorable traits. No, it's just a random impact on a population. So it operates like natural selection. Genetic drift operates on existing variation, but it's not favoring certain individuals. It's just random, right? Random individuals die or reproduce. It's just random.
So like only one part of the population is favored?
No, it's not even about favored. It's just a few individuals who are maybe going to survive. Not the best ones necessarily, just some random. So this is us acknowledging like the universe is random, right? Nature has random impacts on populations. We call those genetic drift. There are 2 kinds that we want to mention. One's called the founder effect. You remember this? Does it sound familiar? No. The founder effect. A founder is someone who, like our founding fathers, started the country, right? I like to call them the founding dads. They founded the country. They're the founders. So founders begin, right? The founder effect is when a few random individuals start a new population. All right, so maybe an example I give in Bio 2 is a few random beetles get blown off the mainland during a storm, and they end up landing on an island and starting a new population there. It's random because we don't know, the color of the beetles doesn't matter, right? You can't be camouflaged from a tornado. Write that down.
Next one, bottleneck.
You can't hide from a tornado with your good camouflage. So it's a random few individuals go establish a new population, founder effect. The other kind, correct, Amir? It's called the bottleneck effect. This is when you have a big population, but a few random individuals survive some sort of event, some sort of disastrous event that kills most of the individuals. Again, this is random, so it's not like survival of the fittest. It's just survival of the randomest. It's just a few random. But the population is substantially and drastically reduced. Like cheetahs. A few random cheetahs survived habitat loss in Africa and hunting, overhunting, poaching. The world population of cheetahs was at one point down into the 20s. 20 to 25 cheetahs in the whole world. There have been active breeding programs to bring their populations back up. They're still very, very much endangered. Cheetahs are. But the consequence of this is now, even though population size has increased, has their genetic variation increased? No. All their ancestors are just from this few group, the small group, this few individuals, right? These 20 individuals. So genetically, they have very little variation, which means they're susceptible to some disaster still. It's called a bottleneck effect. Yeah.
Wasn't elephants endangered?
Elephants are also endangered. Yeah. I think all the elephant species are.
For real?
Are
Like,
we?
Is it
I
because
guess.
they want their tusks?
Yeah, they are poached. They have limited habitat. Yeah. Are we?
Are more animals just continuing to go
Yeah.
endangered?
Yeah,
Is
and
it,
even
like,
worse, and extinct.
Endangered and like, oh, they're okay now. Cause didn't that just happen to bees, or they didn't go extinct, but are they okay now?
No.
Oh.
No, there are huge losses in loss of species. In my field ecology class, I even talk about the fact that based on historical evidence, fossil record evidence, there have been 5 mass extinction events. In fact, actually, extinction is a topic we'll talk about in next week, I think, a little bit. But large-scale events where many species die. In Earth's past, we've had 5. And all the evidence suggests we are currently in a 6th mass extinction. The rate at which organisms are becoming endangered and going extinct is very similar to the 5 previous events. This time we know exactly what the cause is this time. Like we knew what the last mass extinction event was caused by. It was a big meteor impact in the Gulf of Mexico, off the coast of the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico. Took out the dinosaurs 65-ish million years ago.
And we're saying there was 4 previously?
Yeah.
Oh.
So this is all based on fossil evidence. You're like, all of a sudden everything disappears from the fossil record, right?
Like what animals have gone extinct in the past few years?
In the past few years, like the list is
recently,
long.
or-
The list is long, yeah.
This is a long
Like
time ago.
shockingly long.
Cool.
So not much of it is like,
Like, has any animals gone extinct?
Oh, yes.
recently? Do you know of any? Like, do you think?
it's hard to kind of like define that exact moment when you know the very last individual is gone.
Yeah, because.
But based on all the evidence, like the rate of extinction in the tropics is immense. Immense. There are huge impacts there, proportionately bigger than they are in like a temperate place like here, like in Ohio.
Is it weather-wise or like?
But it's based on climate change, yeah, and all the
Wow.
subsequent influences from that. And then of course we have the Arctic and the Antarctic where we're seeing very rapid, drastic changes there too. So we don't see it as much here, just because we live in an area that varies so much in weather, right? But climate is changing, right? Large scale, long-term things. Anyways, it's disappointing and depressing. Let's not talk about that.
I still wanna see a penguin.
Me too. The last thing in this chapter is, why is that here? That's dumb. Is gene flow, the individuals moving into or out of a population. So that's what we define as gene flow, which don't mix up with the concept of genetic drift, because I know they both kind of look and sound similar. But gene flow or genes flowing into or out of a population, this is migration. Genetic drift is that random change to a population. Drift should imply like out of control, like you don't have any control over the direction you're going, you're adrift at sea. Drift is random. Genetic drift is random influence. Gene flow is where individuals migrate between populations, right? So if this is showing in this image, this little light colored bunny going to this population where we have dark colored bunnies, the gene pool changed in this population when this individual migrated to it. This is how we describe gene flow. Okay. Great. We continue. We'll get started on, that's the end of chapter 12. How evolution works. It's actually pretty easy stuff, right? Like this is familiar stuff. Like it should be like, all right, got this. Similar to how chapter 13 goes. Chapter 13 is evidence for evolution. And unfortunately, it's not as clear cut as like we like to talk about it. We talk about, well, how do we remember types of evidence for evolution? What is the dumb word that I make up that's an acronym? You guys remember?
Is it FABE?
FABE. You guys remember FABE? FABE.
I remember it.
Oh.
I just remember
It's
that.
not what
I don't
it
So it's a little bit more than that, but fossils, anatomy,
Babe.
biochemistry, and embryology. Amir,
Oh, I
yes,
remember the embryology.
crushing it.
I remember when we put the card or like the thing.
We made
mold.
fossils.
Yes, I remember that.
Yeah, we made fossils as part of that. Yeah, so fun.
I gave mine to Mr.
I don't
Wilson.
even remember that.
Well, we did it. So, okay, fossils. So, evidence for evolution. So, we've talked now, chapter 12 is about mechanisms of evolution. So, we talk about natural selection, genetic drift, etc. Those 5 things, parts of Hardy-Weinberg, right? But we want to talk about, well, what's the evidence that we have for thinking evolution happens, right? And there are some major areas of evidence. And one of them, like a starting point, it has to do with fossil evidence. So one of the things we think about is like the earth is old, and so there's like a historical timeline built into the rocks of our planet. Right? That's how fossils work, which is really nice. Thank you, fossils. So I get to move here to looking at fossils is covered by the field of paleontology. Great. What is a fossil? How do we define fossil though? Because it's actually more broadly defined than we think. It's just that the most interesting fossils for an evolutionary biologist are the oldest ones. So those are rock, right?
Yeah, so they don't necessarily have to be like
They
bones.
don't have to be rock, right, to be a fossil. That's what we're picturing. But fossil is evidence of a once living thing. Yeah. The older the better, right? Gives us some information about the past. Okay. Now, the next thing we talk about here is going to be a little bit adjusted from what we learned in Bio 2. So I do want to talk about fossils for a second. We're going to talk about types of fossils. In Bio 2, we learned 4 types of fossils, but they're going to be slightly adjusted from how we're going to learn them in here. Sorry. Everybody does things a little bit differently. I think my way's best. All right, so there are kinds of fossils we should be familiar with. And like I mentioned, the most useful ones are rock fossils. So how do rock fossils form? What are the kinds of rock fossils? Did you get your feet stuck?
No,
Okay. You got a cramp up in there?
no.
Okay. Okay. So fossils. How do they happen? Well, the way our textbook talks about them, we talk about compression fossils, which is where a leaf sinks in water, gets covered by sediment, and gets squashed, leaving itself in the rock. That's a kind of fossil. And so that's kind of like combining a couple of ideas. But this is a compression fossil. This is what they call that thing. They also have something, we do talk about this. This is a petrifaction. You remember what a petrifaction fossil is? Petrified wood or something? Yeah, this is when we have hard tissue, usually bone, ends up sitting in water that's rich with minerals. The minerals replace the cells, which is interesting. They replace cellular material. They mineralize it. The minerals dissolved in the water, and then you end up with what is rock. You end up with rock now.
So for compression, it's just like, there's like a layer of water. And
There's always water. It's always in sediment, right? Yeah. So then sediment covers it and it just squishes it. And that's part of a preservation
And then for the
process.
second one, it's like, there's water, but then there's like a bunch of minerals.
Minerals in the water leach into the cells and then mineralize, like they harden. That's what rock is minerals. So it turns this skull into rock. That's really what it is. So organic, as it says here, organic matter replaced by minerals. So that's a petrifaction. We also have something they call an impression, which is, if you think about what I talk about in Bio 2, it's a mold. So when we played with Play-Doh in Bio 2 and we squished a little like plastic dinosaur into the Play-Doh, we made a mold of it, right? They're defining that as an impression up here. Impression, so you're leaving an impression of the body by making a mold, but it's the same thing, different word. What if that impression then fills in with sediment and that sediment hardens, and then we have this, right? So we have an impression here, it fills in with sediment, that sediment hardens, and that sediment is here. That is called a cast. You can't have a cast unless first you have an impression, right? In my Bio 2 language, you can't have a cast unless you have a mold, okay? So cast is just when sediment fills up an impression. Types of fossils, there they are. Those are rock fossils.
For the.
This is recording, right? This would be upsetting. Oh yeah. What?
So, both of these types are rock fossils?
Yeah, all four of these so far. Yeah. But as we had mentioned before, that rock fossils aren't the only kind of fossil. You could. No. Yeah.
I don't remember some of
These
this
are
stuff.
small words, and you're far. What do you need?
I can read it, but what did we say for cast?
Cast is where sediment enters an impression and hardens. And it's that sediment that hardens that forms the cast. So it's just like an impression, a three-dimensional rendering of our kind of negative image that we had when we squished into the Play-Doh. That's not helpful.
It is,
This-
I'm just trying to figure out how to write. I know you're.
This
talking
fills
about
up, yeah,
It's like, that's just like the scales of the dinosaur.
probably.
3D model.
Yeah. It's not the whole thing, right? It's just sediment, but it just squishes in to fill in. Okay. All right. And a reminder here is that fossils may be things besides rock. You could have like insects preserved in amber. You could have footprints. Like there are other things that qualify as fossil. All right, good. The last topic about fossils is the other part that we have to understand when it comes to like looking at and understanding fossils is, well, how old are they? Because if we're looking at change over time, we can look at organisms, how they're different. We can see the change, but we need to know the time frame involved. So how do we know how old fossils are? We got to be able to assign ages to these.
Relative dating.
There are a couple ways we use to describe age of fossil. All right? Good. So, dating fossils. There are two kind of models for this. One is called relative dating. So this is not a way that gives us an exact age. Gives us a basic understanding. Because of the way that sedimentary layers form on top of each other, we know that older layers are lower down. So if you find fossils down here versus up here, you know the ones down here are older than the ones up here. That gives you a relative idea of change over time. Again, we're not assigning numbers. We don't know that this is 163 million years old and this was 120 million years old. We don't know that. But we have relative ideas. Right? This is where we use the idea called the law of superposition. Does that sound familiar?
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
I don't remember.
We will leave off with relative dating. Actually, I'll pick up on that tomorrow. And then we'll start with telling the exact age. All right? That will be tomorrow. And then we'll be through this relatively quickly. There's not a ton here.
Tomorrow.
Bye.
Should put a little outro.